On December 4th, 1872, Canadian Brigantine de Gracia spotted a vessel adrift about 400 miles east of the Azores. It was the Marie Celeste, under sail but strangely silent. When a boarding party went to investigate, they found a seaworthy ship with its cargo intact, a 6-month supply of food and water, and the personal belongings of the captain and crew undisturbed. But every single person on board, Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 7 crewmen, had vanished without a trace. The only thing missing was the ship's single lifeboat. The last entry in the ship's log, dated November 25th, recorded nothing unusual. The mystery of the Marie Celeste had begun, a puzzle that would endure for over 150 years. This is not just a story of a ghost ship. It's a story of real people with names, faces, and families who were left behind to wonder. It's a story of a final voyage, a desperate decision made at sea, and the long unanswered questions that followed them home. The final entry in Captain Benjamin Briggs' logbook was dated November 25, 1872. He recorded the ship's position as 37:01 north and 25 degrees 01 west, approximately 100 nautical miles west of the island of Santa Maria in the Azores. The weather was fair, the wind moderate from the east-northeast, and the Marie Celeste was making good progress toward Gibraltar, her first intended port of call before continuing to Genoa. Briggs noted that they had covered 27 miles since the previous day's reckoning. It was a routine entry, the kind he had made thousands of times in his career. He had no way of knowing it would be the last words anyone would ever write aboard his ship. What follows is an expanded timeline of the final days of the Marie Celeste, reconstructed from the physical evidence found on board, the testimony of those who discovered her, and the meticulous records of the Vice Admiralty court investigation that followed. It's an attempt to understand what might have happened in those desperate hours when 10 ordinary people faced an extraordinary terror. The Voyage, November 3rd through 24, 1872. November 3rd, 1872, New York City. The Marie Celeste lay at her pier at the East River waterfront, taking on the last of her cargo. Captain Benjamin Briggs, 37-year-old and a mariner since the age of 17, supervised the loading personally. The cargo was denatured industrial alcohol, 1,701 barrels of it, destined for the distillers of Genoa, who would use it to fortify wines and produce spirits. It was not a particularly valuable cargo compared to the silk, tea, or opium that filled the holds of more glamorous ships, but it was honest work, and Briggs was grateful for it. His wife Sarah sat in the cramped captain's quarters with her 2-year-old daughter Sophia. She was writing a letter to her mother-in-law in Marion, Massachusetts, her pen scratching across the paper by the light of a small oil lamp. "The vessel is in good order, and the captain is pleased with his command," she wrote. "Arthur will be staying with you, and I depend greatly on the letters I shall receive from him. Tell him Mama thinks of him every day." Their eldest son, 7-year-old Arthur, had been left behind to attend school, a decision that would ultimately save his life and condemn him to a lifetime of unanswered questions. November 5, 1872. Anchored off Staten Island. The Marie Celeste had moved from her pier to an anchorage off Staten Island, waiting for favorable weather to begin the Atlantic crossing. Sarah used the delay to write her final letter to her mother, the Reverend's wife in Marion. "The captain has chosen his crew with care," she noted. "They appear to be quietly capable men, and if they continue as they've begun, I shall have no cause for complaint. The first mate, Mr. Richardson, is a relation of the owner's and has sailed with the captain before. The German seaman seems steady and industrious." Below decks, the 4 German soldiers, Volkert Lorenzen, 27, his brother, Boz Lorenzen, 24, Arian Martens, 25, and Gottlieb Guschdahl, 23, were becoming acquainted with their new ship. They came from the Frisian Islands, where the sea was in their blood, and they spoke among themselves in their native dialect. They had signed on for the passage to Genoa, where they would likely find work on another vessel bound for home or for distant ports. None of them had families in America. None of them would ever see the Frisian coast again. November 7, 1872, departure. The wind shifted to the northwest, and Captain Briggs gave the order to weigh anchor. The Mary Celeste slipped through the Narrows and into the open Atlantic. Her bow pointed toward the distant Azores. On deck, the first mate, Albert G. Richardson, 34, a capable mariner from a seafaring family, supervised the setting of sails. The second mate, Andrew Gilling, a New Yorker of Danish extraction, took his position at the helm. The steward, Edward William Heed, 23, a newly married man from a respectable family, was below organizing the ship's stores and preparing the first proper meal of the voyage. In the captain's quarters, little Sophia played with a wooden toy while Sarah unpacked their belongings. A sewing machine, a recent gift from her mother, was secured to a small table. An upright piano, a luxury on a merchant vessel, stood against the bulkhead. Sarah hoped to teach Sophia to play when she was older. She had no reason to doubt she would have the chance. The Crossing, November 8 through 24, 1872. The first 2 weeks of the voyage passed without incident. The Mary Celeste made steady progress eastward, averaging 6 to 7 knots in favorable winds. Captain Briggs maintained his regular routine: daily readings of the log, careful navigation, Sunday services with readings from the Bible he kept in his cabin. Sarah occupied herself with sewing, reading, and caring for Sophia, who was too young to understand the vast loneliness of the ocean, but seemed content in the small world of the ship. November 15, 1872, Mid-Atlantic. The Mary Celeste crossed the 40th meridian, roughly halfway between New York and the Azores. The weather remained fair, though the days were growing shorter and the nights colder. The German seamen kept watch in 4-hour rotations, their eyes scanning the horizon for other vessels or signs of changing weather. They spoke little to the American officers, but the work was familiar and the captain was fair. There was no reason for discontent. November 20, 1872, approaching the Azores. The ship entered the waters frequented by whalers and merchant vessels plying the routes between Europe and the Americas. Captain Briggs calculated that they would raise the island of Santa Maria within a week, where he intended to take on fresh water and perhaps send word of their progress to his family. In his last letter to his mother, written before departure, he had expressed hope for a fine passage and promised to see her and Arthur in the spring. There is no premonition of disaster, no hint that anything was amiss. November 4th, 1872, the last routine entry. The ship's log for November 24th recorded a typical day at sea. The Mary Celeste was sailing east-southeast at approximately 6 knots, with a moderate breeze from the northeast. The barometer was steady, indicating no immediate change in weather. Captain Briggs noted the ship's position and signed the entry with his characteristic flourish. Below decks, the cargo of alcohol sat quietly in its barrels, some of them beginning to leak invisible vapors into the enclosed hold. That evening, Sarah likely played the piano while Sophia sat on her lap. The captain may have read a passage from Scripture before they retired to their berths. The German seamen stood their watches. The steward cleaned the galley and prepared for the next day's meals. It was an ordinary night on an ordinary voyage. The Crisis, November 25, 1872. Morning, the slate entry. The morning of November 25th dawned clear and cold. Captain Briggs rose early, as was his custom, and made his way to the deck to assess the weather and the ship's progress. The wind remained moderate from the east-northeast, pushing them steadily toward the Azores. He consulted with his first mate, then went below to make his calculations. On the ship's slate, a large board used for temporary notations before they were transferred to the permanent log, Briggs recorded the day's position: 37 degrees 01 north, 25 degrees 01 west. They had made 27 miles since the previous day's reckoning. The slate also contained notes about the wind direction, sail trim, and other routine matters. It was the last piece of writing anyone would ever leave aboard the Mary Celeste. Afternoon, the first signs of trouble. Sometime in the afternoon, the first mate or one of the seamen may have noticed an unusual smell coming from the hold, the sharp, acrid odor of alcohol fumes. The cargo of industrial alcohol was stored in wooden barrels, 9 of which were made of red oak, a more porous wood than the white oak used for the others. Over the weeks at sea, the barrels had begun to leak, releasing flammable vapor into the enclosed space below decks. Captain Briggs would have been concerned but not alarmed. Alcohol fumes were a known hazard on ships carrying such cargo, and proper ventilation was the standard response. He may have ordered the hatches opened to allow the fumes to dissipate. But the weather was cold, and opening the hatches would have let in the damp sea air that could damage other stores. Perhaps he hesitated. Perhaps the decision was taken out of his hands. Late afternoon. The pressure builds. As the day wore on, the concentration of alcohol vapor in the hold increased. The ship's hold was not perfectly sealed. Air could circulate through gaps and cracks, but the fumes accumulated faster than they could escape. Inside the hold, the mixture of alcohol vapor and air approached the critical point at which a spark could ignite it. The source of the spark remains unknown. It could have been a stray static discharge, a metal fitting scraping against another, or even the simple act of opening a lantern near the wrong place. But at some point in the late afternoon or early evening, something ignited the vapor. Early evening. The whoosh. Witnesses to similar incidents on other ships have described the phenomenon: a sudden whoosh of flame that vents through hatches and openings, accompanied by a pressure wave that can blow hatches off their fittings, but leave no lasting fire damage because the fuel is consumed in an instant. That is what likely happened aboard the Mary Celeste. Those on deck would have heard a muffled thump from below, followed by a rush of vapor and flame through the main hatch. The hatches may have been blown open momentarily, then settled back into place as the pressure equalized. There would have been no sustained fire. The fuel was too diffuse, and the consumption too rapid, but the noise and the sight of flames would have been terrifying. Immediate aftermath. Panic and decision. Captain Briggs, his wife, his child, and his crew emerged onto the deck to find the hatches blown open and the smell of alcohol fumes heavy in the air. Below decks, in the hold, the cargo was intact, but the danger remained. Another spark could cause another, perhaps larger explosion. The ship's pump was found dismantled, perhaps in an attempt to assess the hold, and 3.5 feet of water had accumulated below, evidence of the chaos that followed. Briggs faced an impossible decision. The ship was still seaworthy, but the risk of another explosion was real and immediate. The lifeboat, a small but sturdy vessel, hung from its davits. If they took the boat and attached it to the ship with a rope, they could wait at a safe distance until the fumes dissipated, then return. It was a calculated risk, but one that seemed reasonable under the circumstances. He gave the order to abandon ship. Evening. The launch. The crew worked quickly but without panic. They lowered the lifeboat into the water and loaded it with essential supplies, perhaps some food and water, warm clothing, navigational instruments. Captain Briggs ensured his wife and daughter were safely aboard before joining them. The German seamen, the mates, and the steward followed. The rope that connected the lifeboat to the Marie Celeste was secured to the ship's stern. As the lifeboat drifted at the end of its tether, the 10 passengers watched their ship, waiting for the danger to pass. The separation, late November 25th through early December 4th, 1872. Nightfall. The wind shifts. As darkness fell, the wind began to shift. The moderate breeze from the east-northeast that had carried the Marie Celeste toward the Azores began to strengthen and change direction. The ship, with its sails still set, began to move faster than the drifting lifeboat. The rope grew taut. Sometime after dark, the rope breaks. Whether the rope snapped under the strain or was cut to prevent the lifeboat from being dragged under, the result was the same. The Marie Celeste sailed away into the night, leaving the lifeboat adrift on the open ocean. The 10 people in the boat were now alone, miles from land, with only the supplies they had hastily gathered. The following days, drifting. The lifeboat would have drifted with the currents, its occupants scanning the horizon for any sign of rescue. Captain Briggs, a man of faith, may have led them in prayer. Sarah would have held Sophia close, shielding her from the cold and the fear. The seamen took turns at the oars, trying to keep the boat headed toward where they had hoped land might be. But the Azores was nearly 100 miles away, too far to row in a small boat. The North Atlantic in late November is cold and unforgiving. Exposure, dehydration, and exhaustion would have taken their toll within days. By the time the Dei Gracia spotted the Marie Celeste on December 4th, the lifeboat and its occupants were likely already lost, swallowed by the vast gray sea. The Discovery, December 4th, 1872. Morning. The Dei Gracia's sighting. Captain David Reed Morehouse of the Dei Gracia, a 280-ton brigantine bound from New York to Gibraltar, was on deck when his lookout spotted a vessel in the distance. As they drew closer, Morehouse recognized the ship's distinctive lines. It was the Marie Celeste, and it was behaving strangely, sailing erratically as if no one was at the helm. Morehouse knew Benjamin Briggs. They had dined together just before departure, discussing the routes they would take and the conditions they might encounter. The sight of his friend's ship adrift filled him with dread. Afternoon. The boarding party. First Mate Oliver Devereux led a small boarding party to investigate. They approached the Marie Celeste cautiously, hailing her repeatedly but receiving no answer. When they climbed aboard, they found a ship frozen in time. The deck was wet but orderly. The sails were set, though some were damaged. The cargo hatches were secure. Below decks, they found the captain's quarters undisturbed. Sarah's sewing machine still attached to its table. The upright piano standing against the bulkhead. The captain's watch hanging by his bed. Personal effects, clothing, letters, a toy belonging to Sophia, were scattered as if the occupants had left in haste but not in violence. The ship's clock had stopped. The compass was destroyed. The ship's register and the captain's log were present, but the last entry was dated November 24th. The slate with the November 25th notation was found, confirming that the ship had been occupied for at least one more day. The single lifeboat was missing. The boarding party also noted the dismantled pump and the water in the hold, about 3.5 feet. But the ship was still seaworthy and the cargo intact. A sword was found with what appeared to be bloodstains, but later analysis would reveal them to be rust. December 5th through 12th, 1872. The salvage voyage. Devereux and 2 sailors from the Dei Gracia remained aboard the Marie Celeste, sailing her toward Gibraltar, while the Dei Gracia followed. The journey took 8 days, during which the salvage crew noted nothing unusual about the ship's handling. She was in good condition, her mysteries intact. The investigation, December 13, 1872 through March 1873. December 13, 1872. Arrival at Gibraltar. The Marie Celeste arrived at Gibraltar, where she was immediately seized by the Vice Admiralty Court. The court's officers, suspicious of foul play, began a thorough investigation that would last 3 months. They questioned the crew of the De Gracia, examined the ship for evidence of violence, and considered theories of mutiny, piracy, or conspiracy. January 1873, the hearings. The hearings dragged on through January. The crew of the De Gracia, far from being hailed as heroes, found themselves treated as suspects. Captain Morehouse and his men were accused of possible involvement in the disappearance, though no evidence supported the claim. The court's officers, influenced by the writings of a British author who had recently published a sensational account of a similar mystery, seemed determined to find a criminal explanation. March 1873. The verdict. In March, the court finally issued its verdict. There was no evidence of foul play. The crew of the De Gracia was cleared and awarded salvage rights to the Marie Celeste, though the award was substantially less than the ship's value due to the lingering suspicion that surrounded the case. The mystery remained unsolved. The families afterward. In Marion, Massachusetts, the Briggs family erected a centograph in Evergreen Cemetery. The inscription reads simply, Captain Benjamin S. Briggs, born April 24, 1835. Sarah E. Cobb, his wife, born April 20, 1841. Sophia M., their daughter, born October 31, 1870. Lost in the brig Mary Celeste, November 1872. 7-year-old Arthur Briggs, now an orphan raised by his grandmother, would visit that stone for the rest of his life, wondering what happened to the parents and sister he barely remembered. In New York, the young widow of Edward William Head, the ship's steward, was left with no body to bury and no answers to comfort her. She'd been married only a short time before her husband signed on to the Mary Celeste, seeking to provide for their future. She never remarried. In the Frisian Islands, the families of Volkert and Bos Lorenzen, Arian Martins, and Gottlieb Guschal waited in vain for word of their sons. The small communities from which they had come marked them as lost at sea, their names added to the long rolls of those the ocean had claimed. And in Digby, Nova Scotia, Captain David Morehouse and Oliver Devoe carried the weight of the mystery for the rest of their lives. They had found a ghost ship and saved its cargo, but they had not saved its people. They would spend decades defending their actions and wondering what really happened on that late November day when 10 souls vanished into the Atlantic. The Mary Celeste sailed for another 13 years, passing through various owners, her dark reputation preceding her wherever she went. In 1885, her final captain deliberately wrecked her off the coast of Haiti in an attempt to commit insurance fraud. The ship that had survived the abandonment of her crew and the scrutiny of the world's courts was finally destroyed by human greed. But the story of those 10 people, Captain Benjamin Briggs, Sarah Briggs, little Sophia, Albert Richardson, Andrew Grilling, Edward Head, Volkert and Bos Lorenzen, Arian Martins, and Gottlieb Guschal, endures. They were not merely figures in a mystery, they were people who loved, who hoped, who planned for futures that never came. They left behind families who asked questions that could never be answered, and a ship that sailed on without them, a silent witness to the unknowable terror of the sea.